huge shifts out of not sure why that just happened. Sorry about that. Um, it feels like you're steering these huge ships of school systems through some iceberg-ridden waters that are pretty tough. So I wanted to sort of acknowledge that first before we uh, talk about other things. And schools often deal with lots of different kinds of crises. This is a different crisis than often we prepare for because the crisis is ongoing, the threat's ambiguous. It's hard to trust the sources because we've got lots of different advice coming and lots of different, uh, um, the rules of the game change all the time. And where we go to get solid information about what we should be doing today, tomorrow, and next week or can shift greatly. Um, the isolation and the loss that our families and our staff are experiencing are accumulating. There's a lot of community stress going on. I know it's stressful just to have to get groceries, something that was just normal and that I look forward to every week, right? There are changes in how we access supports, and I want to acknowledge that for our staff, for our parents, for everyone, um, we're sort of have had this idea of our normal stress response doesn't ever get a chance to kind of recover from that, and we can actually end up in a situation where we have a bit of stress exhaustion and compassion fatigue. And I want to just talk about that a little bit as we get started here. So as you all know, that a normal stress response causes us to, when we activate our sympathetic nervous system, right? Increase heart rate, increase attention to our surroundings. We're having to pay attention to lots and lots of different things. We're taking in information in new ways, increase in our breathing, and of course activating our stress hormones. A lot of those, we have more stress hormones moving through our bloodstream than we normally do. We have increased reactiveness and difficulties with focus, attention, and problem solving, which impact our decision making sometimes. So all of this can be very, again, very kind of exhausting. And so I want to sort of talk a little bit about the idea of overtime for our staff. Um, we can have this exhausted stress response, and we can see um, more sort of stress, what we might call stress injuries or emotional or psychological stress injuries, and want to think about what that looks like so we can kind of recognize it when we see it in others. There's a decrease, and in ourselves, of course, decreased inability to concentrate, increased irritability, increased reactivity, and this other piece, which is really important. These other last four pieces are really important for doing the work of suicide prevention in schools. The ability to look compassionately on other people. Um, Most people who get into working in schools and working in caring professions do so because they're concerned about the next generation, they're concerned about children, they're concerned about families, and they tend to focus a lot on what the needs of other people are. And what can happen like this is a lot of compassion fatigue can set in. People tend not to focus on taking care of themselves or recognizing when they need to do that, um, and can you know have problems with work avoidance, with lack of self care, and with just feeling fatigued and having a hard time sort of connecting with what's going on for other people. So I say all that to say that, you know, when we're doing the work of suicide prevention or even being able to recognize other people at risk for suicide, you know, how is it at school we show up as our best selves? And some of it means we really have to refocus our energy to look at what's going on for ourselves. What is it we can do and are doing to kind of settle our stress hormones, to recognize when they're in play, to address our own and the social isolation of the people around us, to get peer support. We know that developing routines and following them, to keeping things more simple, to taking things off our plate that we don't need on our plate. Um, I realized a couple of months ago that there were a lot of things I did because I wanted to sort of, I created lots of spreadsheets and reports that nobody ever reads. And I needed to really be able to cull some of that and say, is this really necessary? Is anybody really reading or looking at this stuff? Keeping things more simple. We also know that focusing in our breath, breathing through our nose and not through our mouth can be also helpful in activating our stress recovery response. And also kindness, forgiving ourselves, forgiving others are important. I also want to talk about these last two things, which are really important. Um, is that looking at and paying attention to what is it we're putting in our body, what is our sleep hygiene, have we lost that, are we making ourselves 24 hours available when we need to be able to get some sleep, connecting with nature and making sure we are well hydrated are all also real important things that we forget to do during times of stress. And then of course relying on team support to do work. So um, all of that is to say that, um, there are things we can do um, to, and that we should be doing to practice compassion, resilience, and to share those sorts of things with other folks. And when I talk about this idea of self-care, I want to speak to the idea that there are some kinds of self-care that are, not all self-care is equal. And that there are some kinds of self-care that are better than others. And I often, when talking to folks, ask them to take a look at this idea of these kinds of self-care that help to sort of calm down our stress response. Which ones of these might you look at now and sort of say, this is kind of strong for me now, but this is one piece that I'm not, or this is another piece that I'm not really spending a lot of time with and maybe need to spend more time considering. So this wheel helps me to remember, gosh, I've been staying up really late watching TV or something, and I need to get more sleep or get to bed earlier, whatever it is. So I often use this sort of circle to kind of look at and check what's going on for me. So at that, I want to also say that New York State is also offering this resource, which is New York Project Hope, which is offering it's a website that gives you a free chat and 24-hour connect for anyone who's experiencing stress or trouble coping through COVID. There are also a lot of self-care ideas and apps and options here, and ways to talk to other people who are undergoing stress. There are an awful lot of different resources on this website that can be helpful. And it will be embedded in the slideshow that will be shared with you afterwards. So you can click on that link and get to that website. And please feel free to share that widely. So with that, the agenda for the rest of the next hour and 15 minutes or so would be to really like to share with you a little bit about, how we understand suicide, what's going on with the trends in data, a little bit of background about how we understand risk factors and some theories on suicide. And then spend some time, maybe spend 20 minutes or half an hour on that, but really jump into talking about how we frame prevention in schools, with multi-tiered systems of support, with risk resiliency theory, and with our ideas about how we should be responding or might be responding to warning signs in schools. And then the last half hour or so, along with sort of your questions, your thoughts, your comments, would like to just share a couple of resources about how to assess risk and some resources that are available to you to do this work in your schools, or how to assess your readiness to do school work, some benchmarks to look at. Okay, with that, if there aren't questions or comments, I'd like to go ahead and move on. So so I'd like to talk a little bit about this data and the trends. So suicide is the 10th leading cause of death overall in the United States. In New York State, that means about 1,700 people die each year from suicide, and that's at least what's recorded as suicide deaths. We know a lot of deaths by suicide don't go recorded as such. Among kids in every age group from 10 to 24, so 10 to 14-year-olds, it is the second leading cause of death. 15 to 19-year-olds, also the second leading cause of death. And 20 to 24-year-olds, again, the second leading cause of death. 17.2% of high school students in youth risk behaviors surveys. Many of you are familiar that every 2 years the CDC does a youth risk survey. I'm just recognizing that this is the 2017 number and not the 2019 number. The 2019 number here is 18.8% of high school students. Nearly 1 in 5 high school students say that they seriously considered ending their life within the year previous to the survey, at some point within that year. 13.6% said they made a plan, and 7.4% said they attempted. It's a pretty alarming and concerning problem. I'd like to have you have an opportunity to look at the long-term trend a little bit. As you can see, this is a 27-year, if we look at 27-year trend in suicide deaths in the United States of 10 to 17-year-olds. So this is all middle school, elementary, middle school, and high school students. So if you want to look at this blue line is suicide deaths. If you look at 2007, the trend starts to really tick up. And if you can see 2014, 2015, the climb is much steeper. So it's nearly, well, it's not quite there, but in the coming years, it will be double what it was um, 27 years ago. So, what can you imagine sort of mimics this trend in the United States? What might be some of the things that started to change in society around 2007, you suppose? And you can put it in the chat, or if someone wants to jump in and talk, that's also wonderful. Social media, yes. Social media is a piece of the picture. So the first, let's see, first iPhone was somewhere 2004, 2005. Um, by Facebook, I think was 2007 maybe. But by 2014, about half of middle school students and a lot more than that of high school students had a smartphone. So they had access, sort of unfiltered access to the entire internet and, of course, to social media. Um, the majority of students had from them. So I think that's a really important trend. Although a lot of people deny that in it's of itself, it's responsible for this increases that we're seeing. It's a pretty significant change in the way students receive information and interact with the world. Another alarming and concerning trend, this is United States deaths per year by age range, and it's an 18-year look back from 2001 to 2018, 17-year look back. So this blue, the light blue is 15 to 19-year-olds. The green here on the bottom line is 10 to 14-year-olds. So, I mean, you can see that there is a pretty dramatic climb among older kids, and they're definitely the kids who are more at risk. But what's really concerning is 10 to 14-year-olds deaths. So even though it's a really small number, this consistent climbing where we're seeing almost a tripling by 2018 from what it was. So consistently right around 200, between 200 and 300 up until 2007. And now we're seeing that it's almost nearly 600. If that continues to climb at that kind of a rate, that's a really concerning trend. So people wonder about how this breaks down by race and ethnicity. So among middle school and high school students, by far the kids who have the highest rates are white kids. But the trend of increase is also going up pretty significantly among Black and Hispanic kids as well over the last few years. In New York State, as far as deaths go by suicide, for 10 to 19-year-olds, a 3-year total is 252 deaths. So if you divide that by 3, it's about 83 deaths per year.
Pat, I wanted to interrupt you a second. There's a question in the chat. It says, does this data account for increased population?
The rates do. The numbers do not. So the rates are taken per 100,000 kids, if that makes sense. These numbers, 83 kids, I'm not sure how much the population in New York State has changed. The demographics have changed in New York State, but the population, I don't believe, has increased much in the last 10 years. That's a good question. I don't know exactly. I do know that our rates, that we're having fewer young people and more old people in New York State. That our population in New York State is aging. But in New York State, again, 83 about 83 deaths per year of kids 10 to 19 over those, over that 3-year period. So many of those, most of those are school age, in school. Some of them are not. There's a fair amount of those kids who are college or are out of school, or in jails and prisons, because we know that's a high population. But still very concerning. Another New York State statistic, this is from the Department of Health, is in 2018 and pretty consistently. I want to share with you this information, that kids who were seen in emergency department for self-harming behaviors, about 94 of those in the 0 to 9 age range, and 10 to 19-year age range, about 4,500 of those. If you look at that compared to how many kids are actually hospitalized, either psychiatrically or medically, for self-harming behaviors, it's for 0 to 9-year-olds, it's very low percentages, less than 10%. And for 10 to 19-year-olds, it's about a third. So, I think sometimes there is this false sense that we have in school that if a kid is in school and they're suicidal, that sending them to the emergency department will make, will get them hospitalized. And I just want you to know that even with self-harming behavior, not just ideation, with self-harming behavior, only about a third of kids get hospitalized. Just want to kind of share that with you. We know that even if a kid goes to the emergency room, even if a kid is hospitalized, when they come back to school after those things, they may be at just as much risk as when they left. There's not a lot of magic that happens in the hospital or in the emergency department for kids who are at risk for suicide, which may be a little bit discomforting for folks. But that is the sort of reality of, one of the realities of why it's really important that we think about how we manage suicide risk in school, because we have kids there, whether we refer them or not, we do have kids in school who are at risk for suicide. So I want to shift now to kind of talk a little bit more about how we understand suicide risk factors and warning signs. Any questions about the stats? Any further questions about the stats before we kind of move into shifting or into talking about this? Comments?
I don't know if you see it, Pat. It says, how has the number of suicides been impacted since March?
Unfortunately, we don't have that information yet, and we don't know that information yet. When it comes to getting suicide stats in New York State, it can take up to 2 years before we get that information. We're getting a peek of it in some systems that it's increased. Referrals for suicidality have gone down. Crisis calls to crisis text line have gone up, and crisis calls to the National Suicide Prevention Hotline have gone up. And the one place where crisis calls have really escalated exponentially is the Trevor Project Hotline, which provides services to LGBTQ youth. They are seeing their numbers like quadruple over the last several months. Some of that may be COVID related, and the fact that some of our most vulnerable youth or kids who had conflicts in their families or highly stressed families now may be more likely to end up um, homeless or isolated or without supports that they got before at school. So, that is the $1,000,000 question: is how has COVID impacted our suicide rates? And we just don't know at this point. Um, we can, guess some things by risk factors for suicide, which is really a good segue to talking about how we understand suicide. So the CDC uses the definition of suicidal behavior as self-injury done with at least some intention to die. And that idea of some intention is really important because it's one of the things when we're triaging a student in school, when we're looking at suicide risk, that's one of the pieces we want to look at when we see threats of self-injury or dangerous behavior by a student, or we see behavior that looks like this student is disregarding their safety or doing something to hurt themselves. Did they have some intention to die? Did they understand that the behavior might leave them at risk for dying, or prepare them for dying? That's one piece of the picture we want to look at is intent. Did the student have some intent to die when they engage in this behavior? Because we know that kids engage in self-injurious behavior for a lot of different reasons and with a lot of different ideas going on. We know that there's something called non-suicidal self-injury, where people cut themselves or burn themselves or do other kinds of things that cause pain and disfigurement and injury without any intention of dying by it, to get some kind of psychological relief from stress. And a couple of important theories that we keep in mind as we're addressing suicide and suicide prevention. One of them is called the interpersonal theory of suicide, and that says that serious suicidal behavior really is likely to happen as a result of three factors coming together kind of in the wrong moment in time. So this idea of thwarted belongingness. I don't belong here. Nobody wants me around. I have nobody who really cares about me. My family doesn't want me around. My friends have rejected me. Or I never should have been born. Right? Those kinds of ideas about the self. Or I'm just all alone in the world. I feel very alone and isolated. Combined with an idea of perceived burdensomeness. So, I just cause trouble for the people around me. I don't want to be a burden for my family or kid. I'm a burden on the system. I don't, my family is highly stressed and I just seem to be causing, bringing the stress over the top, whatever it is. I just cause trouble everywhere I go. So, or I'm going to shame my family or embarrass my family or disappoint somebody who's important to me. So this idea of thwarted belongingness and the idea of perceived burdensomeness can be very fluid. Obviously, school counselors, school psychologists, school social workers are often looking at, when we do school climate work, we're looking at, do people feel like they belong? Do they feel like they're connected? Do they have an opportunity to contribute to our school community or to their community at large, right? There is work that we do that can make these two factors be very fluid for kids, right? They can, feel that way, at one point in time during the day, And then when they have an opportunity to do something that really makes them feel more connected, or that someone is connecting with them and making them feel valued, that, you know, that risk can be no more. The third factor here, so what we say is that thwarted belongingness and perceived burdensomeness create the desire to be dead. So two things that we look at when someone's at risk for suicide is, did they have some intention to kill themselves? And also, do they have some desire to be dead? And then, or desire to just never have been born, or desire to go to sleep and never wake up. And then we also look at their capability to kill themselves. So you can't really engage in suicidal behavior unless you have some acquired capability. And while belongingness and burdensomeness are pretty fluid, the idea that capability is acquired and accumulates over time is a piece of the picture. That kids know more and get more sophisticated about killing themselves over time, which something that Aaron had brought up in our discussions before. He didn't know that older people, you know, people in our age group, right, in their 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s, are the group at highest risk. Well, part of that is because we can have an acquired capability that over time we're more sophisticated. If we have an intention to kill ourselves, we know how to go about doing that, and we often have access to the means. If a kid wants to get a hold of a gun, they may have to figure out how to jimmy a lock on a gun cabinet, but adults may actually have the keys to that gun cabinet, right? Or they know how much pills, or can easily figure that out. It's another reason that social media may be implicated and the internet may be implicated in acquired capability for suicide. Kids have at their fingertips the ability to learn how to effectively kill themselves. So rather than taking a handful of Tylenol or Advil and thinking you're going to kill yourself, a kid may know that that's not enough to do that. The other thing about capability to know is that we often think, you know, we often look at how did they try to kill themselves, and we often will dismiss a kid who took 7 Tylenol or something. And maybe that's because it's not a deadly dose. But what's important to understand about kids is that they sometimes don't have that information about what it takes to kill yourself, and that they're often practicing. People practice with suicide. They stand on the edge of that bridge, and they look over the edge of the bridge, and they try to, you know, settle down their stress hormones and their fear of that. They stand on the edge of that high building. They hold that gun up to their heads. They try to imagine what it takes to do that. It's a way of getting ourselves acclimated to the idea of doing it. So that is a part of acquired capability. So if a kid took 7 Tylenol, a non-lethal dose, and said that they really wanted to be dead, we shouldn't dismiss that. We shouldn't worry if that it's an immediate crisis, but we should see it as preparatory behavior, and we should respond to that and do something that is a measured response to that, so that their attempts don't get more serious over time, because that's what happens with kids. We see repeated attempts get more serious over time. The other idea that is important is this idea of stress vulnerability. So we often see there are triggering events when a kid dies by suicide that are either really acutely, like acute life stressors, like a move in the family, or divorce in the family, or a bullying or shaming or cyberbullying incident, or you know, something that is an acute life stressor, but often, but it's not, or chronic life stressors. So acute or chronic life stressors But then also, those have to be coupled with a person's vulnerability to those life stressors. So it's not just the life stressor itself, but it is, you know, that kid's makeup. You know, you can have one kid who everything just seems to roll off their back, and another kid who takes everything really seriously, and you know, and it takes everything to heart, and really gets stressed out. What kind of skills do they have to manage social stressors or emotional stressors? Um, you know, what kind of um, social network do they have? So, um, you know, and or sort of, you know, their past vulnerabilities to stress. Have they been exposed to trauma before? Are they a trauma survivor? So there's this sort of mix of stress vulnerability and interpersonal theory that help us kind of understand how we should be looking at, or how we might look at suicide. So um, I want to talk basically about sort of how we look at suicide risk, and we use this social ecology. So we say that suicide is very complex human behavior, right? It's always influenced by multiple factors, that some of those factors are dynamic and fluid, and some of them are kind of fixed. If my dad died by suicide, there is nothing in the world that anyone can do about that as a risk factor, really, or very little any of us can do about that. So that's a fixed risk factor. If, um, you know, if I have depression, or if I feel all alone in the world or unloved, those are things that are more dynamic and that someone can actually do something about, right? And it might change sort of the whole idea of whether or not I'm at risk in this moment in time. So risk factors, we say, have a social ecology, so that there are some things about an individual, their psychological makeup, their history, um, you know, what's their current life stressors, some things about them that leave them at higher risk for suicide, and some things about that individual that are more protective against suicide. And then there are things about their family and their relationships that we want to take into account. Things going on in their community, and that includes their school community. Is there good access to resources and to mental health care in their community? Are most of the adults in their school community and sort of aware of and recognizing the need for supports when a student has them? Is there a lot of bullying or abuse or other kinds of disasters going on in that community? Is there a lot of isolation, other kinds of traumas and stresses going on? And then things going on in society, as we saw before, you know, the idea that unfettered access to the internet and to social media for most kids is a societal factor. Whether or not society is investing in resources for kids and their families and for our schools is also a factor. Um, So, you know, those are sort of broad ideas about risk, but I want to talk a little bit about the social ecology here. When we look at risk factors, we always look at them in this way. We've taken the most common, most highly associated risk factors for suicide and sort of plugged them into each of these realms. So, having had a previous attempt, having a mental health concern, and so the first thing I want to say about attempts is they get more serious over time. So if a kid has an attempt that is not real serious or not real lethal, we don't want to ignore that. We don't want to necessarily treat it like an emergency, but we want to make sure we get care for that. And a kid has other things to do besides attempting suicide going forward. It is the same thing with suicidal threats. We see people dismissing a suicidal threat of a 5-year-old who just said, or a fifth grader who just, after a really bad attempt, writes on their paper that they just want to die. You ask that kid what was going on, and they say that was just, and you know, they just were feeling pretty stressed. We don't want to completely ignore that. We don't want to necessarily treat it like an emergency, but we want to make sure that kids who are expressing suicidal ideation or engaging in self-harming behaviors have some support, and that we're recognizing those as potentially building capability for kids over time. Most common mental health concerns with kids is depression and anxiety. And we know that most kids who struggle with depression or anxiety don't, that doesn't necessarily get recognized. I believe that, some of the work that we're doing with mental health education in schools is going to make a difference in the long run for that. And then the other piece is substance use. We know that about 50% of high school students who die by suicide have a blood alcohol level at the time. So we know that alcohol is particularly dangerous. It decreases, as you can imagine, it decreases our inhibition. So if I got terrified every time I thought about jumping off that bridge and every time I stood there, if I have a little alcohol in my bloodstream, I might be more inclined, more impulsive, more likely. So a family history of suicide or the death of a parent actually has a really high lifetime suicide risk. So the death of a parent, not necessarily to suicide, but from any means, is associated with a higher risk of suicide. Abuse, bullying, and assaults, sexual assault, sexual abuse, or verbal or physical abuse and assault, all of those things going on. And this idea of meaningful loss is also really important. And of course, what is the meaning of any loss to a kid is the question to ask, right? If the meaning I'm making of a loss of a relationship is that nobody's ever going to want to be my friend, and it is really painful for me that I have to go through this time and time again, that people don't want me around, that I'm pretty unlovable, and I have nothing to contribute. If that's the message that I'm taking away from, a breakup or a friend not being my friend anymore, or not getting enough likes on social media or whatever, then that's a meaningful loss. So what is the meaning a student is making of an emotionally stressful loss? And things like access to means, community violence, social rejection, right? We ask schools to think about, if you're doing climate surveys in your school, while, the majority, to look for those outliers. Are there groups of kids, are there demographics of kids who don't feel like they have any friends? And what we know is that often racial and ethnic minority students can often feel like they have no friends and they have nobody at school that they're connected to. It is another thing that happens with LGBTQ students. So when we're looking at school climate and school climate surveys, it can be really helpful to look at the outliers. Who are the kids and families that are saying they're not connected, and do they belong to specific demographics that we should be focusing in on? And of course, a lack of resources or a lack of coordination of resources. So when schools are engaged in conversations with their community resources around, mental health and substance use, and resources for their students and their families, and how do we get smooth access of good pathways to care for people, that work is really important suicide prevention work. And then again, lots of kids have lots of risk factors, but it's really around these sort of perfect storm of lots of different risk factors coming together at just the wrong moment in time for a kid to be at risk for suicide. Any questions about sort of the way we look at suicide risk or suicide risk factors? Sorry. I forgot to mention this piece, like media portrayals of suicide kind of can, and can kind of increase suicide risk as well. We saw a bump in suicide attempts and suicide deaths after the first playing of 13 Reasons Why on social media. Or on Netflix, 3 years ago, I think it was. So, and there's a long history of research that really points to, the dangers of that. So, I want to just shift gears now and talk about how we frame the prevention of suicide. So before we do that, I guess I want to ask, are there questions, comments, thoughts about risk and risk factors, and sort of how we think about suicide before we move on to talking about what we do about it and how we frame prevention? Anything? Okay, I'll keep moving. If something pops up in the chat, Erin, just stop me, okay? So I'm going to shift gears and speak a little bit about how we frame prevention. And we say that suicide prevention happens in the context of a caring and competent school community. That it is not the responsibility of just one person anywhere, right? That's a really important thing to consider. So when we talk about school community, what are the important words and thoughts you see here? Oh, Kimberly, I like your kitty. So caring, sort of says that we're all kind of challenged to care when we see somebody struggling, right? And competence suggests that in our school community that people need specific competencies around suicide, right? So everybody is challenged to care about the concern of suicide and to have a role in doing something to prevent suicide. And then people need particular competencies to do that. They need a knowledge base to work from. So we're going to be looking at both of those things. How do we create sort of a safety net for people and a safety net for those who might be responding to somebody at risk? Also, how do we create the competencies within our school community that everybody knows sort of how, where, and when to get help?
So we do have a question coming in. It says, how do school districts become better at identifying these students, especially when we have students learning remotely?
Yeah, so that
adds question.
That adds, so remotely adds to the struggle a little bit because you have less information to act on. I have also heard people who are interacting with students remotely say that sometimes the distance of remote learning has allowed for more frank and more honest conversations. I think it can also be an impediment to conversations with students. So there are pros and cons to it, but you're acting on less information because you don't have that student in front of you. But but we should always be relying a bit on what we see, hear, feel, and learn about a student. Um, and um, and we also know that there are a certain number of students who aren't completely participating when we're in remote environments, right? Which is tough. So, so I acknowledge, I guess what I'm trying to do is acknowledge that it is not necessarily easy to do this work in a remote environment, but we need to be able to consider that in the work that we do, and I think that means we need to even be better about it. So we have this idea that nobody struggles alone and nobody tries to help alone. That sometimes we think if we get that kid to the emergency room, if we get that kid to the social worker, it's kind of off our plate and we don't have any further role to take. And while we all need to understand our roles, the idea that we all, that social worker, that person or that counselor, that person who's going to respond to that kid, they need support. They need other people in the school to understand what's going on for that student. They need to be able to work with the family. The family needs to be prepared to come into the building as a partner in addressing suicide prevention. We know that that is one of when you ask school pupil services folks, professionals, what is one of the biggest barriers, and they say it's collaborating and working with parents and families around suicide intervention. So we know there's an awful lot of awareness work that needs to happen with parents to prepare them to understand mental health concerns and also to understand how suicide it can be and is addressed and what it is they can do to keep the kids safe and how they can work with school around it. They often come in with a lot of defensiveness. So it's a piece of the picture. Nobody struggles alone. Nobody tries to help alone, right? I can't help a kid who's at risk of suicide if I don't have community resources to help me, if I don't have protocols and procedures from my school district about how to do this, if I don't have parents working with me and community providers working with me to keep the kids safe. It's, and I would also say that's true for families too. You can love your child, you can try to provide 24-hour supervision for them, but you can't do this all by yourself. If you're a parent, you can't fix it. If suicide is the issue, it's too big for one person to do all by themselves. A provider, a hospital, a parent, or a school professional. So I'm sure this pyramid is familiar to all of you. And we know that 80% of the work of suicide prevention in schools, if we really want to get to preventing this and moving this trend is happening at this universal level. So we know that the promotion of social emotional learning, we know that promoting a positive school climate where kids feel connected and they feel like they have resources and adults who can help out, where everyone knows how and where and when to access help, where there are pathways to care that aren't traumatic, right? If in some school districts in New York State, when a kid says the word suicide, The response is a trigger response to 911. Sorry about that. The response is a call to 911, and a kid is put in the back of a police car with handcuffs and transported to the hospital. That is not, that's a pretty traumatic response. It may be necessary under some circumstances in a highly imminent suicide attempt, but most of the time, that's not what we have. So, and the promoting of protective factors are things that we do all the time in schools. And of course, if we can provide parent education, that's another piece of the picture. So that's, that's where we're going to actually be able to shift this trend toward increased suicidal behavior for kids. Or when we get to these tier 3 things, all we're doing is catching kids as they fall off that cliff, right? Instead of helping to, provide the education and climate where people aren't trying to fall off the cliff, and also providing some early intervention to recognize kids who are running toward that cliff, right? So early identification of kids with mental health concern, determining points of intervention for suicide risk screening. And what I mean by that is this, that I have at least 3 times in my career been in a school in the aftermath of a suicide death where someone in school, a professional in school knew that a child had a certain amount of suicide risk. And someone else was calling the police or doing something to engage disciplinary action for that student, high risk disciplinary action. So the police were being called, they were being expelled, parents were being called, and they were, going to lose their license, or they were going to lose their freedom, or they might be taken out of a foster care placement because this was just one too many things. And the person who was doling out the disciplinary action had no idea that the student had been assessed for suicide risk in the past at school. And there was no emotional or mental health support given to that student during that time. Like, those things were thought of as separate things. So, we can really think about, what are the things that should trigger some suicide risk assessment really quickly, that should trigger some mental health supports for a student quickly in school, and how do we do that? And then, of course, the work we do to establish relationships with our community providers of mental health care, the things we do to look into what that looks like for a kid and their family, what can be shared ahead of time to create smooth transitions. How can we get information back from providers? Can we have relationships where we can get information back from providers when we send kids? And or get, satellite clinics in our schools, right? That's another piece of the picture we can see. And then this last piece is really, really important, but it's, do all of our student services professionals feel that they have the competencies to address suicide intervention? So that's both kind of quick triage assessment, but also, can I do safety planning? Do I, if I bring that child in after they've been assessed outside, what is it I want to put in place for that student to make sure that they're safe moving through our building? Where, while there may be triggers other places in a student's life, in school, often there are environmental triggers for suicide, for kids who are at risk for suicide, and we want to make sure we're problem solving that for our students when they're at risk for suicide. Do our student services professionals have standardized intervention procedures to work from? And is there policy in place that supports best practices in intervention? So those are pieces you want to look at for what is it we do when a kid comes to us and we recognize warning signs or recognize that that's a child may be at risk for suicide. So I want to, I am looking at the time and getting a little bit concerned that I'm taking too long, so I may move through this. There is a 5-minute video on warning signs that I embedded in this, and a 5-minute video on warm handoff. These are both a part of our teacher training, but you can also use them separate from that. So if you want to take the embedded link and share it with staff members at your school, you are welcome to do that. But we also have in-person and virtual staff awareness training that we provide this with. So I'm not going to play this video for you at this time, but I'm going to let you know that you'll have access to it and you can play it moving ahead. I really want to get to some of these other resources real quick because I'm recognizing that I'm taking too long and talking you guys' ear off. We use the FACTS acronym as a way to talk about warning signs to parents, to teachers, to students. So feelings, actions, changes, threats, and situations. We have brochures for each of those groups, and we have a sort of a gatekeeper, a brochure, you know, a one-pager, a poster that you guys can download from our website or download from here and use it. It also uses the FACTS acronym, some do's and don'ts about what they might do to listen to somebody, you know, don't keep it a secret, don't try to handle it all by yourself, you know, do reach out for other help, and provide people with some of these support helplines. So again, this video is a 5-minute video on how to make a warm handoff, because we know that warm handoffs are important, that we lose people in transitions between caregivers. So a student wrote something threatening on a piece of paper, they maybe talked to a teacher and let them know that they're really struggling with something. The teacher sends them down to see the counselor or tells the counselor about it, and the counselor goes to reach out to that student, and the student will say, no, I'm good, you know, I'm fine, I don't know what was going on. So, and the same thing happens. We may see a student who is really in crisis, really at risk at school. We send them to the emergency department, and they're, you know, after some intervention, after some listening, that student feels more supported, less like they're in crisis, more likely to think that they're just in trouble, that this is a waste of time and energy, and they're going to downplay what's going on for them. So warm handoffs are the idea of just that. Like, how do I set up for the next person who's going to talk to this person so that they have the information they need, and that the student feels engaged to talk to that person. So that's what this 5-minute video is, and I'll let you view that yourselves. So I did have these questions for you all. Maybe some folks can take a look at this, but these are some of the things that you want to consider around kind of this. It's important for all school staff to be aware of common warning signs of suicide. There's facts, warning signs, feelings, actions, changes, threats, and situations. Does your building have referral protocol to follow? And does staff receive training in the protocol every year? Even if that is just at a staff meeting, 5 or 10 minutes, saying, here is Ms. Smith, she is our suicide prevention liaison, and please, if you notice any of these warning signs that you see in this protocol, refer them to her, and it should have information, you know, they should have information about what to do if it's at an after-school sponsored, school-sponsored activity, if it's at night at home, when should they escort that student? When is it okay to let that student, leave and go home or go to see that counselor on their own? It should address those kinds of things but be pretty straightforward. How do we do it if it's in a remote environment? How do we refer that student? Just so you know, our center does have trainers, and we have the capacity to train the training in this work. But we also have resources that your schools can use to train staff in grief awareness training. So just providing that to you. I don't want to belabor the idea of protective factors, but I will say that there's an awful lot that can happen in schools that can be protective against suicide risk. So this idea, the CDC actually has guidance documents on the idea of school connectedness, and they say everything that communities ought to be doing around suicide can be underneath this theme of connectedness. We know that kids who are least connected at school are sometimes at the highest risk. However, we also know that when a kid who's highly connected at school, socially connected at school or central to school life, dies by suicide, we know that's most disruptive and most concerning for suicide clusters. So, and contagion. Social emotional learning is another important thing. Just kids learning how to regulate their feelings, how to discuss their feelings with other people, understanding that is a social norm, understanding how to socially problem solve. Those are real important pieces in the picture for suicide prevention, and has been shown in research to decrease suicide attempts in populations. Access to care and good coordination of services, and the idea that the adults in a community can talk about suicide risk and can share information about that and have a shared understanding about what it takes to keep a kid safe from suicide. That stuff is really important. Opportunities to contribute. Generosity and gratitude are very connecting human interactions, and they're sometimes when kids are struggling with stuff, those often sort of go away. Those opportunities to be central to and a part of the school community and to be a part of that. Often this trusted adult, the idea, there's been some research that suggests that kids most at risk for suicide in demographic groups most at risk for suicide, that among those demographic groups, kids who can identify a trusted adult in their life have a 3 to 4 times lesser lifetime or suicide attempt rate than kids who can't identify a trusted adult. So when we do suicide prevention awareness, we talk a lot about what it means to be a trusted adult. It doesn't mean that you necessarily keep secrets or that you have to be the mental health provider for that kid. But how do you understand that critical but limited role of trusted adults? I want to point quickly, just because I'm recognizing I want to shut up in a second so that you have time. I want to point quickly to 2 of the many resources that we have to offer for you all to do this work. One of them is the school readiness workbook. It actually is a series of, and I'm going to stop sharing this screen and go to sharing, hopefully.
And while Pat's switching over screens, I'm just going to jump in here. I'm going to throw in on the chat bar a link to our survey. program survey. So I'm hoping that you guys will complete that, and we'll take the feedback back from it.
I am probably not going to do that now. Sorry about that, guys. Okay. At any rate, there's a link to the school readiness workbook, and what it is it's a series of it takes and breaks down suicide prevention work in schools into 5 categories. One is protocols and professional development for pupil services personnel, and it provides a set of resources for doing interventions. So it provides a set of resources and then also some benchmarks so that schools can assess. A set of folks could take that survey, assess where you're at on a scale of 1 to 5, and figure out what you might want to do next. And you'll have some resources there, but also points to resources at the center and training that we have around that. So the 5 categories are protocols, procedures, and skills for intervening when a student's at risk for suicide. The second one is staff training. Does everybody in school, including our bus drivers and our hall monitors and our school safety personnel, all know how and where and when to get help? What's expected of them if they recognize warning signs? Do they know warning signs? Do they get that? So that's the second piece. Third piece is student education, and do students know what they need to know? Are we integrating suicide and mental health into their curriculum? And then parent education and community. Do we have those community pathways to care? And then the last piece is around postvention. Are we prepared to prevent contagion and to provide grief support to students when somebody dies by suicide? So it has those benchmarks and also resources with it. It is free and available on our website, but you can also click on the link here and get to it. If you'd like further discussion about that, please reach out. The other resource I wanted to point to is our guide for suicide prevention in New York schools. In our partnership with NIAS, the New York Association of School Psychologists, we and Mitch Samet, who is going to be presenting in a little bit, who chairs our Suicide Prevention Council, helped us pull together a guide, develop a comprehensive guide for schools on the resources and the way to think about suicide and suicide prevention in sort of multi-tiered systems of support kind of way. We can get you hard copies of this, but you may also want it electronically. So this PDF is on our website and it's also clickable in. And it has like 4 pages of electronic resources that are sorted by category for you to take a look at. And it has resources throughout it and a clickable table of contents. So you can go directly to the place that you want to go to. If you wanted to look at postvention, you could look at that. If you want to look at staff awareness stuff, you could look at that, or high-risk groups. You can click right to that and find it. So I wanted just to let you know that our guide exists and you have access to that, and we can get you hard copies of it if you need or want to. So that's, I really wanted to leave a couple of minutes to hear from and talk to all of you, and maybe to kind of ask a question of you also, that you can either put in the chat or speak to, that if a colleague missed this morning, you know, what would you tell them, or, you know, what would you sort of walk away with that was one thing maybe that seemed to really speak to you? And with that, I'm just going to hand it back over to Erin a little bit, maybe to, and give you guys about 10 minutes to ask any questions or make any comments, um, um, or answer these questions if you like.
Maybe we just open it up for everybody to kind of discuss amongst yourselves. You are, this is the administrative group, and whether you have tips and tricks that you can share with each other, because we know that during this COVID time and remote learning that Dr. Furman's question is a very salient one, and maybe there are some people that have some ideas of what you're doing in your district to identify kids.
I also want to speak to the idea, you know, when we use the FACTS acronym, and as you look at that, you know, I really didn't do it terrible justice here, but as you take a look at that, it's about observable facts. So it's not just a hunch that something's going on, but what do I observe that's different about this kid that may be related to suicide risk? I don't have to be certain at all in order to report that. So taking it out of the hands of teachers to feel like I need to understand that this is suicide risk before I can bring it to anybody, but finding these really sort of common, observable things that may be related to suicide risk. I think the objectivity of that can be helpful. What did I see, hear, learn about, that I shouldn't dismiss?
Thank you, Pat. I'm not sure if people are going to chime in with some questions, but I appreciate you coming and doing this for us.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Thank you all. I know your time is very precious. And thank you all for taking the time to listen, and please reach out if we can be of more help. I'm going to stay in touch with Erin, who has also, you know, offered to be a conduit for resources from our center. So stay in touch with him about the needs of your districts as well. So thank you, and I hope you enjoy Mitch's presentation later if you're going to be on for that.
And so to follow up, I'm hoping that everybody will complete that survey form, and then I will also send out this PowerPoint, right, Pat? That's what you wanted me to do, send out the PowerPoint, right?
Yep.
Okay, we do have a question in the chat there. Home visits, welfare checks for students. Oh, okay, so this is a comment. Home visits, welfare checks for students who aren't turning in work, logging in, etc. Just to see if we can get a feel for what's going on at home and see if other services are needed. Good, thank you. Yeah, I think it's such a struggle right now. Okay. I'm going to leave this link open, and you guys are welcome to leave, or you're welcome to stay on for the next one. The next one is going to be with Mitch, and that will start at 12:30. So Pat, I'm wondering that train a trainer thing. How many people do you need to do that?
Well, because we're able to offer that remotely, we can do that even with a pretty small group of folks. So we can do, you know, 8 or 10 folks. You know, it's not difficult to do. We're also offering it more, you know, through a couple of different initiatives. We're offering it just sort of broadly out. So if Even if there's just one or two people who want to do it, we might be able to pull them together with other folks. Or if the Catskill Regional Teacher Center is willing to offer, um, we could do it, that we could, that we maybe only have 2 of the 5 folks in our area who want to do the T for T, but would be willing to kind of host it, and we could also advertise for other people to be a part of it.
Yeah, I'd be open to that. I'm wondering if I can pull enough board members, and if we could perhaps train some of our board members, and then we could go out to various districts if they so are interested in having trainings.
Oh, that would be wonderful. Yeah. No, I think that would be great.
How long is the training?
The train the trainer is done so the workshop itself is 60 to 90 minutes. There's a refresher on that's 40 minutes. That's the basic awareness training that people would have, a manual and the slide decks and the videos for.
So there's 2 sessions.
So they would have the capability to train that. You asked what the train the trainer is. It's 3 sessions, and they're each 2 hours apiece.
I'm sorry, I was talking over you. 3 sessions, what?
3 sessions, 2 hours apiece.
All right, so let me see if I have this right. If we want people to do the train a trainer, there's a 3 hours, 3 sessions at 2 hours, and then there's a 45-minute session.
No, just the 3, it's just 6 hours, 3 sessions.
Okay.
Hours.
The 45 was if you wanted a refresher, basically.
45 actually is just like if I'm a trainer, I can provide the 40-minute session or the 60 to 90.
Gotcha. Okay.
The school district, for my school, I provided the 60-minute to 90-minute session one year. The next year, I might just provide the 40-minute refresher.
Okay, so then if it's 3 2-hour sessions, when do you do that? Do we come up with the times ourselves, or like if we wanted to do a Saturday session, is that out of the question because you don't work on Saturday?
Not out of the question. Not my favorite, but I can do
Okay.
or I'll pay Mitch to do it, but one way or another, we'll make it happen. So, but we do. You guys are actually, we are targeting your area for resources, because when we looked at what we've done over the last few years, we noticed that a lot of the more rural parts of New York State, we just haven't reached into there as well as we have some of the other folks. So, we would love to accommodate what you need to have accommodated in order to provide that.
Hey, Pat, how are you? It's Mitch. How are you doing? Question. So they don't need a ton of trainers. They probably need just 1 or 2 in a district to do the training for their district, correct?
Yeah, we've seen some people say I'd prefer to have my district, or I'd prefer to have somebody from a different school come into my school to do this training, because they don't feel comfortable as the school counselor or whatever training their own staff. So sometimes people are pairing up, which also makes sense. So it kind of depends. Like Buffalo City School District wanted they have 100 school counselors. They wanted every single school counselor trained as trainers. And then they went to their school principals and said, this is how we're rolling it out. New York City Schools is just trained 100 trainers as well, but they're borough field office managers who are going to be pushing out the training. In other places, I often think it's helpful to have somebody else so that you can do a couple of slides. least the first few times you're doing it, you can do a couple of slides and then you can sort of look ahead at the next few slides while someone else is doing it. So.
Yeah, and our districts are so small, Mitch, that like our smallest district, I think, has less than 17 teachers. So, you know, we have to figure out how we can congregate our efforts. So I'm thinking maybe, I know there's maybe the school psychologist, some of the people there would be interested, but I'm interested in seeing maybe some of our board members would be interested, and then they could go out to various districts. Not sure exactly how that works, but, you know, and then if I'm trained, I could always go out.
Yeah, no, I
They
think
do.
real value to have someone like a you know, like a regional teacher center to be able to have that capacity. Or, you know, people say we need suicide awareness training. You can say, okay, I got this. You know.
Yeah, it'd be a quick thing if they could just come to me and I could run out. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the way it's organized, Aaron, I think it's really very appropriate because it's like an hour or so. It's very appropriate for a faculty meeting.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
All right, so we'll have to come up with a date and time, and we'll see if we can wrangle up some people. I bet we can get some people to do this.
Okay. Yeah, and we'll do. I mean, if you have a small group and you feel like it's going to make a difference, then I'm free to do it. And if it would be better to sort of pull you into where we're doing it someplace else, I can also do that.
Well, you could do it virtually, right? Is that what you said?
The T for T is done, can be done virtually. You used to do it as a full day, and actually it's closer to 5 hours, but I like to have that expectation of more time,
Sure.
just in case. So I hope good luck to you, Mitch. Going forward, I don't feel to do this any longer because I know you guys are getting started, but good luck, and I'll be back at 3:15, I think, or
Yes, for the teachers. Thank you, Pat.
yeah, and that's the awareness training that we're talking about, so you'll get a chance to see that if you're back, Aaron.
Okay.
Okay, see you guys.
Bye, Pat.
So Mitch, it looks like we have quite a few people registered for this session. Whether they all show up or not, I'm not sure, but, oh, I gotta
You
stop
want me to start
recording.
knocking on